There are moments that no amount of royal training, no amount of protocol, no amount of careful preparation can ever truly ready a person for. Moments that strip away the titles and the palaces and the carefully managed image, and leave something far more raw, far more fragile, far more human standing in their place. Prince William has lived his entire life inside the brightest spotlight on Earth. From the very moment he entered this world, the cameras were already positioned and waiting. He grew up watching his mother move through that same blinding light, carrying grace and heartbreak in equal measure, often at the same time. He stood beside her coffin as a boy, a small figure in a vast and watching world, holding himself together with a composure that quietly devastated everyone who witnessed it. He has carried the weight of a crown that isn't even on his head yet, and somehow through all of it, he has maintained a steadiness that surprised even those who expected very little from him. But there are things that happen inside a home that no public image can permanently contain. Things that press outward through the silence, that find their way into the light whether anyone wants them to or not. And those things remind the world that Kensington Palace is not only a symbol of something ancient and enduring, it is also simply a home. A place where real people wake up in the morning and face things they never planned for, where love and fear and exhaustion share the same walls. Something happened at Prince William's home that nobody saw coming. It wasn't delivered through an official announcement. It wasn't softened by a carefully prepared press release. It was the kind of thing that makes a person stop completely, look up from whatever they were doing, and ask themselves a question they can't easily answer. How does a man carry all of this and still keep moving forward? What unfolded shook royal correspondents and casual observers alike. It reached people who had never followed the monarchy, never cared about palace life, never given much thought to what happened inside those famous gates. Because what it revealed wasn't about royalty at all. It was about something much older and much more universal than any institution. And once you understand the full picture, you begin to see William differently. Not as a symbol of continuity, not as a future king managing an impossible inheritance, but as a husband, a father, and a man standing at the center of one of the most quietly devastating chapters of his life. This is that story. And it begins, as all true stories do, long before the moment that shocked everyone. Prince William has always been described as the steady one, the composed one. The man who learned, perhaps more painfully than anyone around him fully understood, how to hold himself upright in public no matter what was crumbling in private. There is something almost architectural about the kind of composure he developed. Something that was clearly built under enormous pressure, over a very long time, from materials that were not always easy to work with. But steadiness has a cost. And the walls of a home, even one surrounded by palace grounds and centuries of tradition, cannot always contain what is quietly building inside them. His story is not fascinating because of the crown he will one day wear. It is fascinating because of everything he has had to carry just to reach this point. The losses that shaped him before he was old enough to process them, the pressures that never fully lifted, the family fractures that played out in real time in front of a global audience that had strong opinions about all of it. And then, finally, a chapter so unexpected and so deeply personal that it brought an entire nation to a kind of collective stillness. To understand what happened, you first have to understand the man it happened to. And to understand the man, you have to go back to a childhood that was never entirely his own. There is something uniquely difficult about growing up in a spotlight you never asked for, one that was positioned before you were even born. Most children are allowed to stumble privately. They fall off bicycles on quiet streets. They cry in bedrooms with the door closed. They move through awkward and uncertain phases without anyone documenting every inch of it. William never had access to that particular kind of freedom. And yet, remarkably, the person he became suggests that the privacy he was denied never fully defined him. Something in him resisted being entirely shaped by the watching. He was a curious child, energetic in that way that tends to unsettle formal environments. Reportedly stubborn with a quiet determination that runs deeper than ordinary stubbornness, the kind that produces either impossible people or genuinely resilient ones. Those who knew him in those early years consistently described a boy who was aware, sometimes uncomfortably so, of exactly what he represented. He understood from an early age that his life operated under a different set of rules than almost anyone else on earth. His mother understood that too. And she made a deliberate choice to prepare him for something the palace itself couldn't teach. She introduced him to realities that royal life instinctively shields its children from. She wanted him to encounter struggle in a form that was real rather than curated. She wanted him to understand that the people who would one day look up to him weren't abstractions or crowds or subjects, but actual human beings carrying actual pain. That lesson embedded itself in him deeply, in ways that have surfaced again and again throughout his adult life. And then came the loss that no lesson, however carefully given, could ever have softened. When his mother died, the world watched a boy grieve in front of every camera on Earth. The composure he displayed broke hearts precisely because of how controlled it was. People watched and understood, quietly at first and then loudly, that no child should be asked to do what he was being asked to do, to stand in front of that much sorrow with that much dignity, to absorb a nation's grief while managing his own, to perform steadiness at an age when falling apart entirely would have been the most natural response in the world. What that experience did to him in the places no camera could reach is something William has only ever allowed glimpses of. But those glimpses, when they have come, have been consistent in what they reveal. A man who learned in the hardest possible school to guard his interior world with extraordinary care. To build something sturdy around the most tender parts of himself, not because he was cold, but because he had learned very young what happened when those parts were left unprotected. He grew into adulthood carrying all of that. He moved through the rituals of royal young manhood with a seriousness that read as genuine rather than performed. Military service that he approached with real commitment. Charity work that became increasingly personal, increasingly invested, increasingly his own rather than simply a requirement of the role. A slow, sometimes halting, but ultimately sincere journey toward understanding who he actually was beneath all the expectation that had been placed on him before he could even speak. And then, somewhere in the middle of all of that becoming, he found Catherine. Their relationship became one of the only things in his public life that observers consistently described as feeling genuinely his own, not arranged into existence, not managed into the right shape by advisors. Something that grew between two people who chose each other deliberately and continued choosing each other. Through years of pressure that would have quietly dismantled most relationships without anyone noticing. He became a father 3 times, and each time people watching noted something shifting in him, a warmth that hadn't always been visible, a groundedness that felt earned rather than performed, an emotional openness that softened the composure without dissolving it. But what was gathering behind all of that, behind the stability and the family and the careful forward motion, none of it was visible yet, and what was coming would change everything. There are public figures who exist primarily as symbols, and then there are moments when a symbol becomes a person. When something happens that makes the watching world suddenly see what was always there beneath the image. For much of his earlier public life, William occupied a particular and carefully maintained kind of space. He was respected broadly and sincerely. He was admired in that general, slightly abstract way that tends to attach to people who represent something larger than themselves. He carried himself with dignity. He said the appropriate things at the appropriate moments. He embodied faithfully and without obvious complaint the continuity and stability that the institution he served prizes above nearly everything else. And then something shifted. Not suddenly, not with the sharp drama of a single moment, but gradually and then unmistakably. It didn't happen the way shifts usually happen in public life. There was no engineered viral moment. No carefully choreographed reinvention. No media strategy designed to reposition his image with a new generation. What happened was quieter than that, and because of its quietness, considerably more powerful. William began to speak in a different register. Not in the formal, measured cadences that royal figures have deployed for generations, where every word is considered and every sentence serves an institutional purpose, but in a register that suggested actual interior life, actual experience. He spoke about mental health at a moment when men in positions of power and visibility simply did not do that, not seriously, not vulnerably, not in ways that cost them anything. He spoke about grief with a specificity and honesty that made it clear he had spent real years sitting with his own, rather than simply surviving it and moving forward. He described what it was like to lose his mother in ways that landed with audiences, because they were not the rehearsed answers of a man who had made peace with something. They were the honest words of a man who was still, in some ways, living inside it, the public leaned in. Here was a man who had every reason and every institutional incentive to coast on symbolism, who could have maintained the comfortable distance of the role indefinitely and no one would have expected anything different, And instead he was choosing something more exposed, more honest. More human, the response was something beyond ordinary public approval. It was the specific feeling of connection, of recognizing something real in a figure who had seemed, until then, to exist slightly outside the ordinary range of human experience. His advocacy around mental health took on its own momentum during this period, growing into something with genuine weight and genuine reach. Working alongside Catherine, he helped shift conversations that had been politely avoided into conversations that felt necessary and urgent. He wasn't lending his name to a cause in the way that public figures often do. He was building something, investing in it, carrying it personally. And then, in a way that no advocacy work could address or soften, the family around him began to fracture. His brother's departure from royal life, the interviews that followed, the accusations and the counter-silences, the very public drawing of lines between people who had once been close, watched in real time by a world that had strong feelings about all of it. William said very little through all of that. His silence was analyzed relentlessly by people trying to read into it whatever confirmed what they already believed, but he held the silence anyway. Because something was coming that made everything that had come before it look like preparation. Something that none of the public fracture, none of the institutional pressure, none of the years of carefully maintained composure had actually readied him for. There is a kind of public trust that cannot be manufactured or accelerated. It accumulates slowly, through consistent behavior over time, through choices that reveal character rather than just image. William had built that trust carefully and over many years. Not through a single dramatic gesture, but through the quiet accumulation of showing up, of speaking honestly when honesty costs something, of demonstrating through his actual choices that the institution he represented was capable of something more than preservation. Kensington Palace had settled, in the public imagination, into a particular kind of story. A home where 3 children were being raised with what genuinely appeared to be warmth and intention. A household that was navigating extraordinary external pressure while managing to project something that looked, from the outside, like actual contentment, like a family that had found its footing. And then Catherine was gone from public life, not with a dramatic announcement that gave anyone time to prepare. Not with a statement that framed what was happening and provided a context that made sense of it. She was simply quietly absent. Engagements disappeared from the calendar. Appearances that had been expected didn't materialize. And into the space that absence created, the world poured everything it had. The speculation that followed was extraordinary in its scale and its intensity. The internet generated theories at a pace that had its own disorienting momentum. Photographs were studied for detail. Every word of every statement released by the palace was read against what was not being said rather than what was. The atmosphere became something uncomfortable to witness, a combination of genuine public concern for a woman many felt real affection for, and a kind of frenzied curiosity that repeatedly crossed lines without appearing to notice them. William continued to appear publicly throughout all of it. He attended engagements. He stood in front of cameras. He performed the duties the role required. And he said almost nothing about what was happening at home. Those who watched him closely, who had enough reference points to read the difference between his ordinary public composure and something else, noted a quality in how he was carrying himself during this period that was difficult to name precisely. A weight that was different from the weight of institutional duty, something more personal than that, something more raw. He was managing something enormous in private, while the world speculated loudly and relentlessly about what it was. And then Catherine spoke for herself. The video she released, quiet and direct and entirely her own, in which she told the world about her cancer diagnosis, became one of the most watched and most emotionally affecting moments in recent royal history. The response was immediate and overwhelming, not simply sympathy, though there was an enormous amount of that, something deeper than sympathy. A collective recognition, felt by people across enormous differences of background and opinion, that behind all the theories and the headlines and the breathless speculation, there was simply a real woman facing something genuinely frightening. A real family inside a real home, navigating something that no protocol and no precedent and no preparation had equipped them for. What had happened at William's home shocked everyone, because what had been happening there was deeply, profoundly, quietly human. And humanity in its most unguarded form, stripped of management and image and institutional language, has always had a way of stopping people cold. The moment Catherine's diagnosis became known to the world, something in how people saw William shifted. Not gradually, not through the slow accumulation of impressions over time. Immediately. Permanently, he was no longer, primarily, the future king navigating the complex machinery of institutional continuity. He was a husband whose wife was ill. A father trying to protect 3 young children from something no child should have to be close to. A man standing at the center of a situation that his wealth and his title, and every century of royal preparation behind him, had given him absolutely nothing to work with. He responded in the way that turned out to be distinctly, recognizably his. He stepped back from obligations that could wait. He made clear, without speeches and without statements, through the simple evidence of his choices, that the center of his life in that moment was not the role but the family. People who had built strong criticisms of what they perceived as his emotional distance, who had interpreted the composure as coldness, suddenly found themselves looking at the same man and seeing something entirely different. They saw someone revealing, through the actual weight of what he was carrying, exactly where his values sat when the performance became impossible. The public response existed in multiple registers simultaneously. There was genuine and enormous sympathy. There was also continued scrutiny from corners that scrutiny tends to come from. Because William inhabits a space where almost nothing he does escapes interpretation through at least several competing frameworks at once, and personal crisis doesn't pause any of them. But the strongest thing, the thing that cut through all the noise, was recognition. He was not handling it with perfection. No one does. There were moments when the weight he was carrying was visible, in ways that composure couldn't entirely conceal. The months of public uncertainty had accumulated in how he held himself, in something around his eyes, in photographs taken when he wasn't expecting to be watched. But he was handling it with the same fundamental quality that had defined him since the day a boy stood in impossible grief with the world watching and somehow remained standing. Presence, endurance. Something that looks from the outside like grace, but which anyone who has ever carried something truly heavy knows is actually something more effortful and more costly than grace. It is the daily decision to keep going, made again every morning, without applause. The fractures that had played out so publicly in his family took on a different shape against this backdrop. Whatever had broken between William and Harry, whatever pain lived in that space, and whatever distance had grown in the years since, it existed now alongside something that simply dwarfed it. Something with the specific power of serious illness to clarify what actually matters and what turns out, in the end, to matter much less than anyone thought. People who had held firm opinions about the royal family, who had picked sides and stayed on them, found those opinions developing complications they hadn't asked for. Because watching a man try to hold his family together through something this serious has a way of getting past the frameworks that usually structure how we see public figures. It gets past the institutional and the political and the dynastic and reaches something more fundamental. William's home became, for a time, one of the most discussed households on the planet. Not because of scandal in the conventional sense, not because of anything that could be spun or managed or turned into a narrative that served someone's purposes, but because of something quieter and more devastating and more universally legible than any of those things. Real life had arrived at those doors, uninvited. Completely indifferent to the centuries of protocol on the other side. And it had made its presence felt in the way it always does, by refusing to be managed, by refusing to perform for the cameras, by insisting on being exactly what it was. Stories like this one don't end cleanly. They don't arrive at a moment of resolution and then hold still. They continue, they evolve, they find new ways to demand something from the people living inside them, and what they demand changes as the story does. Catherine began treatment. She withdrew from public duties in a way that was clearly both medically necessary and genuinely difficult for someone who had built her public role with such evident care and commitment and personal investment. The updates that came were carefully measured, clearly shaped by a desire to protect her privacy and her recovery rather than to satisfy a public appetite for information. They came only when there was something real and substantive to say, and William kept moving. What observers noted watching him across this period was a quality that tends to be undervalued precisely because it lacks the drama that draws attention: reliability. He showed up for the work that needed doing. He continued to represent something stable at a moment when stability was requiring genuine effort rather than simply being his natural default. The carefully maintained distance that royal public life requires became, paradoxically and unexpectedly, a form of intimacy during this time. Because people understood in a new way what was behind the composure now, they understood the cost of it. They understood that something real and heavy and personal was being held behind it every time he appeared in public. And that knowledge made the composure feel more meaningful rather than less, more human rather than less. His children remained substantially shielded from public view throughout the most difficult phases. That choice spoke clearly about his priorities, about the hierarchy of obligations he was working with when they came into conflict. Whatever the role required of him, it would not require his children to perform a normalcy they weren't feeling. To go through the motions of public life while privately navigating something this serious. As Catherine recovered and began slowly and on her own terms to re-enter elements of public life, something was different in how the two of them appeared together. Not dramatically different. Nothing performed or signaled for public consumption. Something quieter than that. A different quality in how they occupied the same space, in how they moved in relation to each other. Not the closeness that is displayed, but the closeness that has been tested and has held. People noticed. People who had watched them for years, and who had the reference points to recognize the difference between what they were seeing now and what they had seen before. The story of what happened at William's home became, over time, a story about something that public figures of his kind almost never allow the world to see. Not triumph carefully presented to make people feel good, not scandal providing the satisfactions of exposure. Not the institutional narrative of an ancient organization managing its image into the next generation. But the specific and unglamorous texture of a person being asked to carry more than seems reasonable and making the choice every single day over many months to carry it anyway, to keep going. To be present, to endure. His legacy, in whatever form it eventually takes shape, will carry the mark of this chapter in ways that will not be erased. Not because of how he performed through it, but because of how he endured it. The difference between those two things is not small. Performance can be learned and rehearsed and executed competently even under pressure. Endurance is something else entirely. It is what remains when performance is no longer possible. He is still in the middle of a story that has not finished. A father raising 3 children inside an extraordinary set of circumstances. A husband who has been through something with his wife that changed them both. A son shaped by losses that accumulated before he was ready to bear them. A future king who has been required, by forces entirely outside his control, to become more genuinely human in the public eye than the role has traditionally allowed or encouraged. And in that humanity, unplanned and unpolished and entirely real, there is something that commands a different kind of respect than anything the institution itself could generate. Not the respect that comes from position, not the deference that comes from history, but the specific respect that comes from watching someone face something genuinely hard and seeing them refuse to disappear into it. The house on the grounds of Kensington Palace held something during this chapter that stopped people who were paying attention, not a secret finally surfacing. Not a scandal reshaping what everyone thought they knew, something more profound than either of those things and in some ways more difficult to sit with. It held a family. Moving through something real, holding on to each other through it, together. And sometimes the most powerful story that exists is simply that one. There is a version of William's story that belongs entirely to institutions and succession, and the complicated long history of a monarchy navigating its own survival into a century that questions its relevance. That version is real and it matters, and it will be told many times by many people. But there is another version, the one that this chapter of his life made impossible to look away from, that belongs to something much older and much simpler than any institution. It is the story of what it actually costs to hold yourself together when the ground beneath you shifts. Of what love looks like when it stops being a feeling and becomes a daily practice, a series of choices made under pressure without any guarantee of how they will turn out. Of what a person reveals about themselves not in the moments when things are working, but in the long and quiet and unwitnessed moments when they genuinely are not. So here is what I want to ask you, and I mean it as a real question rather than a rhetorical one. When you watch this story unfold, did something in how you see him change? Did the distance between a public figure and a real person close, even slightly in a way you didn't expect? And what do you think this chapter, with everything it demanded and everything it revealed, says about who William actually is beneath everything he is required to be? Leave your thoughts in the comments. This is the kind of story that means something different to everyone who encounters it, and your perspective genuinely adds something that the script alone cannot reach. If this story moved you or made you think about something you hadn't considered before, share it with someone who would find it just as compelling. And subscribe for more stories that go past the headline and into the real and human moments that actually shape a life. Those are always the stories worth telling. And there are always more of them than anyone expects.